Hi, everybody. Ian Bremmer here with your latest edition of The Red Pen, the pre-Labor Day edition, before I head back to New York City.
The Red Pen.
We are taking our Red Pen today to a recent op-ed from the Washington Post, written by Marc Thiessen. He's a Post columnist and a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, former speechwriter for President George W. Bush, generally smart guy. It is titled, "Greenlighting the Taliban's Takeover of Kabul is a National Disgrace." And the article makes some strong statements about how and why the Taliban came to take control of Afghanistan's capital city. So let me unpack some of his arguments for you here and explain why and where we disagree. Let's get out the red pen. First, Thiessen argues that all the horrors the world witnessed over the past 2 weeks might have been prevented had the United States opted to take over Kabul rather than letting the Taliban do so. I would caution, the enemy gets a vote. Thiessen here is comparing the real world with all of its unpredictability to a counterfactual one where everything goes according to his plan. Even if the horrors he cited had been averted, wouldn't others have unfolded? So putting thousands of Americans back on Kabul streets would have meant putting them in the crosshairs of terrorist groups like ISIS-K. Do we believe these groups wouldn't have targeted Americans in Kabul with suicide bombings like the recent airport attack, or even engaged them in firefights? Biden had to decide between two very unpleasant options, and he chose the one he believed would put fewest Americans in harm's way. Next, Thiessen cites a former American senior general officer to argue that the U.S. military, and I quote, could definitely have secured the capital, at least the green zone where Western embassies are located, plus access to the airport. So for starters, Thiessen bases his argument on the views of one former senior general officer whose identity we don't know. How widely shared are those views among current military officials? That strikes me as important. If the 20-year war in Afghanistan has taught us anything, it should be some caution before arguing what the U.S. can and can't accomplish on the ground in Afghanistan. Certainly about whether or not we'd be able to secure a city of over 6 million people indefinitely with a few thousand troops. Before leaving office, let's keep in mind the Trump administration brought U.S. troop numbers in Afghanistan to just 2,500. That's a 19-year low. And by the end of July 2021, only 650 remain. So taking over Kabul would have required something politically incredibly challenging, a substantial troop surge that would have put more American servicemen and women in danger. Now, Thiessen doesn't explicitly call for a surge, but I think the upshot of the critique is clear enough. There is an argument to be made for a surge, even if it's a politically very unpopular one, but he should tell us how many additional troops would we have had to set in and for how long to hold on to a city that the United States at that point had already lost. Point three. Thiessen calls the Biden administration's decision to cede Kabul to the Taliban a dereliction of duty unlike any we have seen in modern times. I think we should keep in mind that it was Trump and not Biden who went over the Afghan government's head back in February 2020 to negotiate with the Taliban and agreed to remove all U.S. troops from the country. There were strong U.S. political considerations for doing so. I get it. But from that point, the Taliban's takeover of Kabul had become a foregone conclusion. So I don't think it's fair to only focus on the Biden administration here, or primarily for that matter. Next point, Thiessen writes that the administration's withdrawal put the safety of American civilians, service members, and Afghan allies in the hands of terrorists, referring to the Taliban rather than U.S. armed forces, and led directly to the deaths of 13 Americans in an Islamic State attack on the Kabul port. Now, earlier, he presents the Taliban as an organization whose word General McKenzie should have trusted. Quote, the Taliban offered to allow the U.S. military to take responsibility for security in Kabul, but we declined. So what makes us want to believe that a terrorist organization intent on retaking power would honor a pledge to allow the U.S. forces to secure the capital city. In other words, which Taliban is it that we're dealing with? Not clear from the piece. And finally, Thiessen concludes by arguing that Biden's decision to let the Taliban take over Kabul led directly to the deaths of 13 Americans in an Islamic State attack on the Kabul airport. Now, as horrifying as the images coming out of Afghanistan are, Biden had decided to not risk even more U.S. lives in the war's twilight. Staying at the airport and trying to hold on to Kabul for a few more weeks would have helped the United States evacuate more Afghan partners, to be sure. But it would also have risked the lives of thousands of U.S. soldiers. One thing I think that all of us can agree on is that this has been a sad and embarrassing ending to the 20-year U.S. war in Afghanistan. We've left countless Afghan allies behind despite promising them safe passage, and there are even still some American citizens on the ground that have not yet been able to be evacuated. August's events are going to no doubt cast an added shadow of grief over the coming 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. The Biden team has certainly made mistakes in executing this exit, and I've spoken about them. But dereliction of duty? No, not in my view, at least. As we head into this Labor Day weekend, stay safe and be well, and we'll see you again very soon.